I am in awe of those novelists who create entire worlds that don't exist, but they bring you right there. You can see it, you care about it, and then they create these characters that you care about. You might love them, you might hate them, but you root for them. And you know what's a great novelist when you're at the end of a long book and you want there to be more, you want to know what happens next. One of my favorite novelists is British-born. She's a woman who wrote these long series of family sagas. These can go 600 or 700 pages long. And then after having a number of bestsellers, she started writing a series on the history of the spirituality of the Church of England in the 20th century. I was just overwhelmed by her insight, her understanding of psychology and theology. And when I really like a novelist like that, I'll collect first editions. So she takes up an entire shelf in our library. And as I was looking at that and considering all the time I had spent at these women's creative words, my wife walks into the library just at that time, and I pointed at the shelf and I said to her, "Do you have any idea how many hours of pleasure this woman has given me?" And I saw an expression on her face I'd never seen before. And there might be a better way that I could put that. She goes, "You think, Gary, maybe? You think? But maybe you're not into the arts." I'm amazed at the creativity of the people who came up with an iPhone. I don't even understand. I can't conceive how I can hold a piece of plastic, punch a number or a name or a face, and suddenly I'm talking to someone thousands of miles away. I can't even begin to understand how that works. I'm amazed at the creativity behind air travel that lets us visit our family members. Unless you book on Southwest, then you're visiting La Quinta Inn and baggage claim. But it gives me the life I could have. I get to have special times with my little grandson there who likes me almost as much as I love him. And those are moments I never could have enjoyed in earlier generations. In fact, 120 years ago, this blows me away to show you how far creativity has advanced. 120 years ago, in 1900, no human being had ever traveled faster than 100 miles per hour. Never. No human alive had ever gone as fast as 100 miles per hour. To get 3 men to the moon, 69 years later, they figured out how to send 3 men over 24,000 miles per hour. The leap in creativity and application is amazing. It leaves me awestruck, but as a Christian, I recognize that our ability to create and solve problems like this comes from the fact that we are made in the image of God, whose creation marks us. It describes him, it marks us, and it's what we are called to be. In fact, if you want to know what this sermon is about, it's real easy. You were created to create. It's not everything about you, but it can't be anything less. It must be at least that. You were created to create. In fact, I want to make the case you will have the healthiest life, the most satisfying life, and the most fulfilling life when you give yourself over to the act of creation as an act of worshiping our Creator, God. As we're talking about level up, how do you take your life to the next level? You take more seriously the fact that you were created by God to create. It's one of the most precious things about God, one of the brilliant things about God. In fact, the Bible begins and ends with God creating. In Genesis chapter 1, the very first verse in the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The first thing he wants us to know about him, more than his power, more than his truth, more than his brilliance, he is behind everything. He is the creator who made all that is. And although he goes into the Bible creating, he actually goes out of the Bible creating. One of the last images is Revelation 21, where God is making the new heavens and the new earth. In verse 5 of 21, behold, I am making. In the Greek, that's present tense. God is continuing to make all things new. It is a lie to suggest that he created the world, washed his hands of it, and then went off on retirement. He is still making, because that's what he does. He is the creator who continues to create. Which is why we see his stamp of his creation everywhere you go. You go into the depths of the ocean. It's amazing, the creativity of how creatures can exist underwater their entire lives. I talked to a mountain climber once he blew me away with his insight when he was taking this trail, never taken really. He thought probably nobody else climbed that path that year. And he got near the top, and there was this stunningly beautiful flower just sitting there. And he realized God creates this flower knowing that no one may ever see it. But why does he do it? Because he's a creator. He's into beauty for the sake of beauty. God just creates, even though much of us, we won't see most of what he creates. And it's one of 1 million reasons that we worship and love and adore Jesus. The early Testament writers wanted us to know that Jesus wasn't just a God, because in the first century, they would look at gods of the hills or gods of the valleys, that Jesus was the God who created everything. John chapter 1, verse 3 says this, through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. Jesus is behind everything. He created everything, and made in his image. We were created to create ourselves. Beautiful picture of this goes back to the Old Testament times when God decided to create a physical temple for people to worship this spiritual God. And the creative gifts that were required for this temple, of this place of worship to be built, are enormous and many. Look at this. In the book of Exodus, to create this temple and all of the stuff around it, they needed carpenters, they needed metal workers, they needed weavers who worked with fine linen and yarn, people who can make curtains out of goat hair. Now, I don't know about you, you're probably more creative than I am, but I've never seen a goat and thought, there's a curtain in there. Or somebody would tell me to make a curtain. Well, where are my goats? I need goats. I don't know how you get from a goat to a curtain. Somebody figured it out thousands of years ago. People who are skilled with needlework. People who make olive oil for lamps, so they're growing, but then they know how to process it. The big, beefy construction workers. Those who can make elaborate robes and garments for Aaron and the priests. Bakers, incense makers, people who grow and mix spices, all different kinds of gifts. And all of them speak of the Creator God. In fact, Exodus 28:3 says this, you shall speak to all the skillful, God says, whom I have filled with a spirit of skill. Your ability to create comes from God's creative presence within you, being made in his image of God. He gives that they can do something like make Aaron's garments to consecrate him for my priesthood. It was a divinely given skill to make clothes. I often don't think of clothes as so holy, but God says, no, my creativity is seen through people who can make clothes that no one else can make. Now, while we're all in the image of God and all have the ability to create, some have special giftings. And we see that this is what happened in the Old Testament for the temple. The Lord said to Moses, see, I have called by name someone whose name begins with B, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. And I've filled him with the Spirit of God, with ability and intelligence, with knowledge and all craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs to work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, in carving wood, to work in every craft. And behold, I have appointed with them someone whose name begins with O, the son of someone whose name begins with A. Look, if parents would give them sensible names, I would read them. Of the tribe of Dan, I will read Dan, okay? I'm a fan of Dan, I can read that. But here's the sentence that I really want you to hold on to. And I've given to all able men ability that they may make all that I have commanded you. Okay, let's pull that sentence out. Let's look at it more carefully. He says this, I have given to all able men ability. Why? That they may make all that I have commanded you. Because I believe every person in this room and every person watching online is created in the image of God, I believe every one of you have certain creative abilities in the arts, in tech, in engineering, you name it. Have you ever wondered why God gave you that ability? This might blow you away. This might change your life. If you want to level up in 2023, consider this question. If God has given me ability, what if, just ask this question, what if your creative ability and your creative passions are God's command? What do I do? How do I express myself? What does it mean for me to be made in the image of God? What are your creative abilities? What are your creative passions? What if that is God's command for you that he wants you to do, to express himself within you? Now, there are multiple ways to create, different skills, different callings, different seasons of creation throughout life. I think the one that often isn't seen as creative, but I think will change your life when you view it that way, is when I see young couples create families. I don't know if anything marks us as being made in the image of the Creator God as much as the fact that we can literally create families. In fact, we can create human beings who share our DNA. It's amazing. And maybe you create them through adoption or through other means, but the fact that you would create a family is one of the most important creational things that you can do. Years ago, I was being courted by a church in Texas to come, and they were flying me in, and I was picked up at the airport by a young man, really, I mean, he was smart, he was a lawyer, he was an impressive young man. I found out he was engaged. His name is John, and Naomi, there they are there. And then as the years went by, they got married, and then they had a kid, and they had another kid, and it was just fun to see this family. When I first met him, just a single guy, and then I met a single woman, and they create a marriage, and then they create a family, and we look forward to their Christmas cards every year because they're really creative, the different types of things they do, and you would just see it grow. And I just thought that there was no family, and now there is. It was a guy living by himself in an apartment, marries a wife who makes him throw away most of his clothes and all of his furniture, and then they get together and form a family, and it's an amazing thing. Now, it doesn't always seem like it's that creative because it's a lot of work, it's a lot of mess. I was talking to heard of a new father. He's just 5 months old as a dad, first son. And he and his spouse had a different view about whether you needed to burp babies after you give them a bottle. Apparently that's a matter of debate. I didn't know that. It's been a while since I've been in that situation, but he was of the camp that no, you don't need to burp the baby. That's what they used to do. So he'd given his son a full bottle, and they got done, and to make the point to his spouse, he lifts up his baby, he says, see, baby doesn't need to burp. Baby doesn't need to burp. And the baby deposited half of that bottle straight into his mouth. I said, it's kind of good because half digested, you get the little cheese curds and whatnot, and at least in that moment, baby needed to be burped before he was lifted up. And it calls creative gifts forward. I remember our son, which is kind of fun to remember now because he's a brilliant young man. But there was a time we're just trying to get him out of diapers. And Lisa said, you got to think up something. And so I drew a picture of a fire on a piece of toilet paper, and I threw it in the toilet. I said, hey, champ, you got to come in. There's a fire in the toilet. We need somebody to put it out. Graham was all boy. He saw that. He knew what to do, and he showed his fireman abilities, and he put out the fire. When you're going through all of those things, it may not feel creative, but I don't want you to lose the awe that there was just you as a single person. And whether then you get married or you adopt or you conceive or you foster, now you're creating a family. It's such a beautiful thing. And maybe you're not called to focus on creating a family. Maybe it's a new movement. In the 1940s, Dr. J. Edwin Orr took a number of Wheaton College students to England. They were touring a lot of religious sites, and one that moved the students as much as any was the old Epworth Rectory, where John Wesley had spent a good bit of his life. If you're familiar with John Wesley, he was a powerful servant of God. His journals, his work on the Holy Spirit, some of the best classical works I've read. When he came over to the United States, God used him to shepherd in one of the greatest revivals this country has ever seen. So it was a great moment for the students to go through the house and see the kitchen where he had eaten and some of his books. And then they went upstairs and they saw this simple bed, and the tour guide pointed out these two patches on the carpeting where Wesley had prayed so often that he had worn holes in the carpet. He would just cry out to God, we need a new movement. Bring your Spirit. Send your Spirit to do a new work, to call the world back to you. And to see that it wasn't an accident that God had moved this man and used this man in such a powerful way, to see what was behind it, the prayer. It was so moving to the students. Then they had to leave, and so Dr. Orr shepherds them back into the tour bus. And as they would do in that day, he's counting 1, 2, 3, 10, 11, 12, and somebody was missing. So he goes back into the rectory and doesn't see anybody downstairs, and he goes upstairs, and then he starts to hear a young voice cry out. And he looks into Wesley's bedroom, and the young man's knees are right where Wesley's knees had put two patches in that rug. And the young man's crying out, God, do it again. Would you please do it again? We need a new movement. We need a fresh movement from your Spirit. Would you come again? Of course, Dr. Orr was moved, but he has a whole tour bus of students waiting. So he said to the young man, whose name was Billy Graham, we really need to get back on the bus. And you know the story. God did it again. A man said, I believe, God, you might use me to create a new movement, to bring a new revival, and I want to see that happen. God, would you do it again? And so I would say to the young people, as you're planning to go to college, as you're thinking about what you might do, what will you give your life over to? Is it just a bigger bank account? Is it just more fun times? Or is it possible that God would use you as a young woman or a young man to help create a new world? But I don't want the seniors to get away from this either. We're all called to keep creating. A seminary professor wrote a short post about his father. When he turned 80, he listed the 5 most common sins of what he called the 5 sins of old men, and began praying that they wouldn't be in his heart. Here's what he said were the 5 sins of old men: jealousy of the young, laziness, insufficient prayer for children and grandchildren, turning on the television to meet my loneliness, and bitterness. You know the cure for every one of these temptations? You know the antidote to every one of these sins? It's to keep creating. You're not jealous of the young when you're creating. You're still focused on how God might use you. You're not lazy. Creating gives energy. It gives life to your life. It's a reason for you to get up and to do something. You're not having insufficient prayer for children and grandchildren. You haven't stopped creating your family. Yeah, they might be far away. They might even be done with you, but you're still praying. You're still doing what you can to keep creating this family as God keeps creating this world. You're not turning on the television to meet your loneliness. There might be some in the evening, but your day has meaning and purpose. And you're not bitter. If you're creating, you're filled with hope. You're filled with expectancy. You're continuing to create. And that's what God calls us to do, because creating gives life to our life, which means one of the greatest temptations to us living out the image of God, his creative spirit within us, is passivity. It's passivity. If I was really mean and evil and I had the power to do it, I think what I would want to do to pull people away from the image of God in them, to keep people away from doing the work that God created them to do, was to find a big screen-based pastime where they waste away their hours, not creating, just passively watching. I remember when I used to read electric meters to help pay for college bills, and I would read sometimes at mobile home parks that had a lot of older people, and I could basically know the plot of every soap opera going from mobile home to mobile home with thin walls. I don't even know if they still do soap operas like that. But I remember thinking back then, is this really how I want to spend my years, to save up just to spend my time in the day, in the morning, catching up with this? But it's as much a temptation of the young. The video games have gotten so good and so fascinating, and they can enrapture young minds. They can spend hours, and they really live. They do what they have to just so they can play that game. And I just want to say to the younger people, instead of doing your own creation, if you're spending 3 hours a night playing Fortnite or 7 or 8 hours on the weekend, you know what you're doing? You're making somebody else rich. Instead of developing your own resources, instead of putting your stamp on the world, you're just passively absorbing what someone else has done. And I want to say this because, especially to the young people, there is a certain element of creation where the young are in their sweet spot. You just see it, the way our brains work. For one, creating a family is a younger person's game as far as biologically being able to conceive children or even having the physical energy to raise them and train them. But then even in the arts, it's amazing how there's this flush of youth that brings a brilliance and a genius. In fact, most of you know what this sculpture is. You've all seen this, I'm sure. Pieta, do you know who made it? Michelangelo. You know how old he was when he made this? He's 23 years old. People often call this the greatest sculpture ever done, except maybe David, which Michelangelo also created. He was a hefty 25-year-old when he did that. I talked about novelists. I really think the mother of the novelists, the one that really showed what could be done, that good English literature programs look back to, is Jane Austen. She died when she was 41. What does that mean? Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, all those were written when she was in her 20s and 30s. And while we need to continue to create, there is this sense of when you're young, when it's really flowing. I face this in my own life, just writing nonfiction books. My book, Sacred Marriage, which has sold the most, was written in my 30s. And it's probably sold about as much as all the other books combined. And I feel like I have more to say and more experience. I might even be a better writer. And I tell churches, we could also talk on a lifelong love. We could talk on cherish and now making your marriage a fortune. How about you talk about sacred marriage? I don't know if I ever top it, and I feel like I'm going to be Jimmy Buffett singing Margaritaville, the end of his days. It's just early. There's just something about it. It's just the way it is. And that's why, young people, I don't want you to lose these years to some passive entertainment, enjoying someone else's creation and not being who God created you to do. And it's not just screen watching. I think especially for the young, it's things like drugs and alcohol that take you away from creating. You're just escaping. I know I sound like just an old-fashioned pastor talking in Colorado of all states about pot, the first state to legalize recreational use. But look, I'm not your dad. This is not about trying to control you. Can I just say, if you know you're created in the image of God, would you just do the research to what smoking pot does to a brain younger than 25 that hasn't fully formed yet? Just listen to the scientists that you're putting a ceiling on your intellect. You're putting a ceiling on your creative ability. Why would you do that instead of wanting to be the person God created you to be? Actor Rob Lowe is about my age. He's been famous his entire life. And he got caught up in the fast life, and it was almost ruining him. So over 30 years ago, he decided to become sober, and he entered recovery. 6 months after he made that choice, he was at a Rolling Stones concert, who were famous for their partying. And, being a famous actor, he's invited back after the concert to go party with Keith Richards. Now, the Rolling Stones were partiers. Keith Richards was legendary until he also became sober to do it. And Rob was torn. He goes, man, this was a moment. This was the test. I knew how it was wrecking my life, and I've had just 6 months of sobriety, but this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But he made the decision, no, I can't go. He was talking to Jan Wenner, the publisher and editor, creator of Rolling Stone magazine, which is the social journal of the time when I'm growing up. There's no really publication that has that wide readership now. And Jan, as the publisher of the Rolling Stone, had been to all of these. He had partied with all of them. And I was shocked at what he told Rob. He said, Rob, you didn't miss much. And I would say the fact that Rob is still acting and doing a podcast and writing books, a lot of that goes back to a decision he made 30 years ago. Am I going to take sobriety seriously? And every creation since then can be traced back to a decision to keep a mind that's able to create. Jan Wenner went on in this conversation. It was fascinating to me to say this. This is Jan Wenner. All I know is that drugs and drink have destroyed more talent than I can think of. And I can't think of any talent that's really been enhanced by it. I could give you a list of people whose talent was destroyed because they destroyed their own ability to concentrate, to think, and the discipline necessary to do great work. I don't know about you, young, middle-aged, or old, I want to overachieve. There was a famous radio host who had the largest radio following anybody ever in this country that had a phrase where he would say, with half my brain tied behind my back just to make it fair. I never felt like I could say that. If you tied half my brain behind my back, I don't know what I would be doing. I don't want to tie half of it back to something like excessive screen watching or substances that would impact my brain and not let me be who God created me to be. Now, let me show, I'm not saying watching Netflix is always wrong. Lisa and I have our series that we watch. But I look at it like this. I use the Sabbath, not just for the week, but for the day. The Sabbath says there is a time to recreate, to step back, to rest. But how does the Sabbath commandment begin? Anybody know? Before God says, take the seventh day off, he says, 6 days you shall labor. The Sabbath is a two-pronged command. Work for 6 days. Be who God created you to be. Bring your talent, bring your creativity. On the seventh day, rest up so you can start fresh. I think you could look at the days like that. We might look at something in the evening, but we've got the 6 hours or the 7 hours, the 8 hours where we will labor and be what God created us to be. And then you get some time to restore. But when you turn that around and you live for the Sabbath, you're not just living a subhuman life, you're living a sub-Christian life. It comes down to this. Why do I say this? Why do I sound so passionate to young people? I can tell you this honestly. I want you to preserve your mind and your energy. I want you to be inspired because I want to read your novel. My favorite novelist that I mentioned, she retired 10 years ago. She just got tired. She's made all the money she needs to make. I wonder if there's another young woman who has the understanding of psychology and theology and can paint pictures of places and people that I could care about as much. Is there someone here who will create that anew? Is there someone that can take technological advance to the next step, making it even easier for us to stay connected and to visit each other? Is there a new artist, a new song, a new poem? What might God be creating? What even in this room is God waiting to see created in 2023 that doesn't exist yet. Here's my appeal. If you want to go a level up, don't be a passive consumer. You're created in the image of God. Be a creator. It's who God has created you to be. And look, we're Christians, all right? We don't have to say it's all a capitalistic exercise. You're not a poet because somebody buys your book of poems. You're not a singer because you're on the radio. You're not a novelist or a writer because 1 million people have read your book. You can create because God calls you to create. Think of the God who created that flower at the top of the mountain that no one might see. It's just who God is. It's who you're created to be. Create to create. Don't create to be famous. Don't create to be rich. Create as an act of worship because you're created to create. No one else may see that table that you make. No one else may ever hear the song you create on the piano or the guitar. No one else may ever read the poem. You just leave it behind. But it's a beautiful act of worship to express who God made you to be. And when you look back at your life, it will be the acts of creation that you remember and the acts of creation that bring you back alive. Prima ballerina Marta Gonzalez Valencia became famous in the 1960s in New York. She danced Swan Lake, and the creativity and the artistry that she brought to the role had people spellbound, looking at her beauty, her grace, her strength, her athleticism. Fast forward 50 or 60 years, and she's in a nursing home, suffering from Alzheimer's. The family would visit her, and there's this vacant look, and when they show up, is she there? Does she know we're here? They just didn't know. But one of her carers came up with a brilliant idea. Knowing how famous she was and how hard she'd worked creating those dances for Swan Lake, they said, what if we put headphones on her? What if we let her hear that music? Why don't we see what happened? This is what happened. Whether you're young, middle-aged, or a senior, whether you're an engineer, you work with wood or linen, whether you can make a curtain out of a goat, you were created to create, to go to the next level up in 2023. Sit with God, ask God, what should I be creating? That maybe because I feel like, well, I can't earn a living or others don't appreciate it, that I've put on the shelf. And how can you become more fully alive and worship and honor the Creator God? By creating as He's gifted you to create. I read a statement in second person at the start. If you are convinced by these scriptures, I want you to read it with me. Let's read this together. I will have the healthiest life, the most satisfying life, and the most fulfilling life when I give myself over to the act of creation as an act of worshiping my Creator, God. Let's pray. Father, it's difficult to worship you for all the millions of ways we might worship you, but this one of you as Creator is among the best because it's who you are. And I pray there would be this sense of awe that it's who you created us to be, to create as we have been created, to release the Spirit that you give to us when we become believers, that our passions might very well be your commands. I'm excited, Lord, at how young lives can be preserved for great creative endeavors, how middle-aged and older lives can be renewed as they give themselves over to this work in 2023. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.